Alright, so in this lesson, we'll actually be importing data from Reddit. We're doing this both because we want to have a more interesting data set for future lessons, and because we want to give an example of how we can use MongoDB to import and analyze data without necessarily knowing the full structure beforehand. So as a part of this, we'll go over an example of how to import data into MongoDB from an external source using Node.js and the Node.js driver for MongoDB. So this is the Reddit's technology page, and Reddit actually has the feature where if you append .json at the end, it'll return a JSON object. So this is what we're going to be importing into MongoDB. Okay, so first we're going to curl this to a file, just call it reddit.json. Let's open reddit.json, and we can actually look a little bit at structure. So I was looking at this before. So you can see here that this is one giant JSON object, and it has a field kind, and it has data. So actually it looks like data and children inside the data sub-object actually has the list of the stories we want. And it looks like for each story, the data is actually all the information about the story itself. So the way we're going to actually import this is using Node.js. So let's take a look at that. So this is an example of how to import data from an external source into MongoDB using Node.js. So here we actually have the Mongo client right here. Just like before, we connect to MongoDB. We also have this other library. It's a Node.js library for making requests to other sites. So here, after we've connected to MongoDB, we then just say request and give it the Reddit URL and a callback for when we receive a response. So once we get a response from Reddit, we say, okay, is it an error? Is it a good return code? And if so, we can actually parse the body as a JSON object. So this is basically parsing our JSON string into the native JavaScript object. So after we parse it, the first thing we do is we say obj.data.children, which we found out was the list of our stories. And then just to clean it up a little bit, we actually map this array. So this is an array of our stories, and arrays have a map function. And basically what this does is it applies this function to every element of the array and replaces that element with whatever this function returns. So we saw earlier that in our JSON object, for each story, story.data was actually the interesting information. So we just do this to clean it up, so we just get an array of all the stories. So after that, we have our array of stories, and we can actually insert the entire array. So here we just get our collection, let's store it in the Reddit collection, insert our stories, and this function will actually tell us whether we successfully inserted our stories and actually return what we inserted it. So we just log that here, so we then know that it succeeded. So now let's run this. Alright, so it looked like it completed successfully. So just to check and actually see our new Reddit data, let's go to Mongo and use course, then do db.reddit.find.pretty. So we can see here, all these stories are the same as the ones on our technology homepage, except now that they're in MongoDB, we can actually do some interesting queries on them and ask some more interesting questions than we could when they were just on the front page. So we could say things like which author is posting the most, how many comments are there on average, things that we couldn't do very easily when it was just in the web interface. So for later examples, we'll actually use this more interesting data set rather than the grades collection we were using before. And so the thing to note here is that we could actually import this data knowing very little about the format of the data. All we really needed to know is that the children were in an array and where to find that array, so we could actually insert the documents individually, and just a little bit extra for the extra cleanup that we did. But other than that, we had really no idea when we inserted this what the structure would be. We had no idea it would have a URL, we had no idea it would have a name field, we had no idea would have a num comments field. We just sort of inserted this into MongoDB, and these documents may be different structures, they may be different sizes, but it's fine. So now that they're in MongoDB, we can ask these questions, we can make queries and learn a little bit more about the structure of our documents. So that's what the rest of our examples will be using.